The blood on the wagon seat was still wet when Asher Pierce found her. A young woman collapsed beside the overturned cart with her mouth open in a silent scream that would haunt him for weeks to come. He had been tracking elk through the Sierra Nevada foothills that September morning in 1872, his rifle slung across his broad shoulders, when he heard the crash echo through the canyon. By the time he reached the scene, the bandits were long gone, and what they had left behind made even a hardened mountain man like him feel rage coil hot in his chest. She could not have been more than 20 years old, dark hair matted with dirt and blood, her calico dress torn at the shoulder. Asher dropped to his knees beside her, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for injuries. Her pulse beat steady beneath his fingertips, and relief flooded through him. She was alive. But when her eyes fluttered open, brown and wide with terror, she tried to speak, and he saw it. Where her tongue should have been, there was only a scarred stump. The sound that came from her throat was raw and animal, and tears streamed down her face as she clawed at his buckskin shirt, trying to communicate something urgent. Asher had lived alone in these mountains for the better part of 10 years, preferring the company of wind and stone to the complicated cruelty of civilization, but he recognized desperation when he saw it. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to calm her slightly. "You are safe. I'm not going to hurt you." She pointed frantically toward the scattered contents of the wagon, and Asher followed her gesture to see trunks spilled open, clothing and household goods strewn across the rocky ground. He moved to investigate while keeping her in his peripheral vision, noting how she struggled to sit up despite obvious pain. Among the wreckage, he found papers identifying her as Violet Emerson, traveling from Sacramento to meet family in Winnetka, California. There was also a leather journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting. When he returned to her side with the journal, her eyes lit up with something like hope. She reached for it with shaking hands, flipped it open, and began to write furiously. The pencil was still tucked in the spine, and Asher watched as words appeared on the page. "They took everything. My trunk with my money, my father's watch. Please, I need to get to Winnetka. My aunt and uncle are expecting me." Asher read the words, then looked up at her face, taking in the determined set of her jaw despite the tears. She was studying him too, he realized, cataloging the long dark hair tied back with a leather cord, the heavy muscles of his arms and chest, the scars that marked him as a man who had survived things most people only imagined. He stood well over 6 feet tall, and he knew he probably looked frightening to someone like her, but she met his gaze without flinching. "How did this happen?" he asked, gesturing vaguely to her mouth. She flinched then, and something dark passed over her features. Her hand moved to the journal again, but she hesitated, then shook her head. Whatever story lay behind that mutilation, she was not ready to share it. "All right," Asher said. "That is your business, but we need to get you out of this canyon before those bandits come back or the wolves find us. Can you walk?" Violet nodded and accepted his hand when he offered it. She was small compared to him, barely reaching his shoulder, but when she stood, she did so with a straight spine that spoke of inner strength. Her ankle gave out on the first step, though, and Asher caught her before she could fall, swinging her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. She stiffened at first, then relaxed slightly, one hand coming to rest against his chest. Through the leather of his shirt, he could feel the heat of her palm, and something shifted in his chest. It had been so long since he'd been touched by another person with anything other than violence or transaction. "My camp is about 3 miles north," he said, already moving. "We will spend the night there, and in the morning I will take you to Winnetka. It is about 20 miles southwest. 2 days on foot, maybe less if your ankle heals enough." She tapped his chest, and when he looked down, she was mouthing words carefully. "Thank you." He could read the shape of it on her lips, and he nodded. The walk back to his camp took longer than usual with her weight in his arms, though she was light enough. Asher found himself hyper-aware of every breath she took, every small movement. She did not struggle or complain, just watched the landscape pass with those dark eyes, occasionally pointing at things. A hawk circling overhead, a marmot darting between rocks. Each time she wanted his attention, she would tap him gently, 2 fingers against his collarbone, and he would look. By the time they reached his camp, tucked into a small cave with a clear view of the valley below, the sun was beginning to set. Asher had built a life here over the years, simple but comfortable. Furs for sleeping, a fire pit ringed with stones, supplies stored in wooden crates he had hauled up piece by piece. He set Violet down carefully on a folded bear pelt and watched as she took in her surroundings. She pointed at the cave walls where he had scratched marks to count the seasons and raised her eyebrows in question. 10 years, he said. I came here in '62 after the war. Needed to be away from people for a while. She reached for her journal, which she had clutched to her chest during the entire walk, and wrote quickly. Which side? Union, he said. I grew up in Pennsylvania, fought with the Army of the Potomac. You? Too young to remember much. Born in Ohio in 1852. Father brought us west in '64. Asher did the math. She was 20 years old then. Young, but not a child. He could see that in the way she held herself, in the shadows behind her eyes. He built up the fire and set water to boil, then pulled out his supplies to make a simple stew. Violet watched everything he did with intense focus, and he realized she was trying to understand him the same way he was trying to understand her. When he offered her dried meat and hard bread, she accepted gratefully, eating slowly and carefully. After the meal, she wrote in her journal again and held it out to him. How will we communicate when I do not have this? It was a good question. Asher thought about it while he cleaned his knife by the firelight. Can you read and write? He asked first, and she nodded. Good. That helps. But we will need something faster. Can you make sounds even if you cannot speak words? She demonstrated, making various noises in her throat. They were rough and sometimes harsh, but she had control over them. All right, Asher said slowly. We will work something out. Tapping helped today, and I can learn to read your face better. You are expressive. She ducked her head at that, and he thought she might be blushing, though it was hard to tell in the firelight. When she looked up again, she tapped his arm to get his attention and then placed her hand over her heart, pressing firmly. Then she pointed at him. He understood. You are welcome. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her whole face, and Asher felt something warm unfold in his chest. It was dangerous, that feeling. He had learned long ago that caring about people led to pain. But looking at this young woman who had survived something terrible enough to steal her voice and was still trying to communicate, still fighting to reach her destination, he found it hard to maintain his usual distance. That night, he gave her the warmest furs and took a position near the cave entrance, his rifle within reach. He did not sleep much, listening instead to the soft sounds of her breathing and the occasional cry of a night bird. Once, he heard her whimper in her sleep, a sound of distress that had him on his feet before he fully realized he was moving. But she settled again without waking, and he returned to his post. When dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Asher found Violet already awake, sitting up and watching him with those dark eyes. She tapped her chest twice, then made a walking motion with her fingers. You want to try walking? He asked, and she nodded. He helped her to her feet, keeping one arm around her waist for support. She was stiff from sleeping on the ground and from her injuries, but when she put weight on her injured ankle, she managed it with only a slight grimace. She took a few experimental steps, and Asher stayed close, ready to catch her if she fell. After a few minutes, she pulled out her journal. It hurts, but I can do it. We should start for Winnetka. Are you sure? Asher asked. We can wait another day, let you heal more. She shook her head firmly and wrote again. My aunt and uncle will be worried. The stage was supposed to arrive 3 days ago. So they prepared to leave. Asher packed his essential supplies into a leather satchel, including food and water for the journey. He would come back for the rest later. Violet had nothing but the torn dress on her back and her journal, everything else scattered or stolen. Before they left, Asher dug through one of his storage crates and found a spare wool shirt that he offered to her. She took it gratefully and pulled it on over her dress. It was enormous on her, hanging past her hips, but it would keep her warm. She rolled up the sleeves and looked up at him with the expression that might have been amusement. He felt the corner of his mouth twitch. You look ridiculous. She made a sound that might have been a laugh and punched his arm lightly. The journey to Winnetka was slow going. They followed deer trails and old mining roads through the foothills, stopping frequently to rest Violet's ankle and to drink from the canteen Asher carried. He found himself watching her constantly, noticing the way she moved, the small gestures she used to point out things that interested her. A cluster of wildflowers growing impossibly from a crack in the rock. A family of deer watching them from a distance. Each time she wanted to share something, she would reach out and touch his arm, just a brief contact, and he would follow her gaze. By midday, they had developed a rhythm. 2 taps meant stop. 3 taps meant danger. A hand on his forearm meant look. A hand over her heart meant gratitude or sometimes just acknowledgement. It was a simple language, but it worked. They stopped to rest beside a stream, and while Violet soaked her sore ankle in the cold water, Asher caught fish with his bare hands, a skill he had learned from a Miwok elder years ago. When he emerged from the stream with 2 fat trout, Violet's eyes went wide and she applauded silently, her hands coming together in obvious delight. He cooked the fish over a small fire, and they ate in comfortable silence. Afterward, Violet pulled out her journal again. "Tell me about yourself. How did a Union soldier end up alone in the California mountains?" Asher was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire. He did not talk about his past often, did not think about it if he could help it. But something about Violet made him want to share, made him feel like she would understand. "I saw things in the war that changed me," he said finally. "Did things too. When it was over, I tried to go home, but I did not fit there anymore. Everything was too loud, too crowded. I felt like I was suffocating. So I headed west and kept going until I found a place quiet enough to hear myself think again." Violet was writing when he finished. "Do you ever get lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but lonely is better than feeling lost in a crowd." She stared at him for a long moment, then wrote one more sentence. "I understand that more than you know." He wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to know her story, but he could see the shuttered look in her eyes and knew she was not ready. So he let it go and banked the fire instead. They reached Winnetka late the following afternoon. The town was small, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and maybe 24 houses scattered around. It sat in a valley between rolling hills, surrounded by oak trees and scrub brush. Asher had been through here a few times over the years, trading furs and buying supplies, but he had never stayed long. Violet walked beside him now, her hand resting lightly on his arm for balance, and he could feel the tension in her body as they approached. People stared at them as they passed, taking in his buckskin clothes and long hair, her torn dress and borrowed shirt. He heard whispers, but ignored them, focused instead on Violet's directions. She pointed to a house at the end of the street, a neat white structure with a front porch and flower boxes in the windows. Before they reached the gate, the front door flew open and a woman rushed out, followed by a portly man with a thick mustache. "Violet!" the woman cried. "Oh, my lord, Violet, we thought you were dead!" Violet released Asher's arm and stumbled forward into her aunt's embrace. The older woman was crying, patting Violet's face and hair, checking her for injuries. The uncle hung back slightly, his eyes moving between Violet and Asher with obvious suspicion. "Who is this?" he asked, gesturing at Asher. Violet pulled back from her aunt and fumbled for her journal, writing quickly. "This is Asher Pierce. He saved my life. The stage was attacked by bandits. He found me and brought me here." The aunt read the journal over Violet's shoulder, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, you poor dear. Come inside, both of you. You must be exhausted." "I'm fine," Asher said. "I should be going." But Violet's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. She shook her head firmly, her eyes pleading. "Please," the aunt said, seeming to understand. "At least stay for supper. Let us thank you properly. I am Martha Emerson, and this is my husband, George. Any friend of Violet's is welcome here." Asher felt trapped by propriety and by the desperate look in Violet's eyes. He did not want to stay in town, did not want to be around people and their questions and their noise, but he found himself nodding anyway. The Emerson house was warm and cluttered, filled with the kind of homey touches that Asher had not seen in years. Lace curtains, embroidered pillows, photographs on the mantel. Martha immediately took charge, sending George to draw water for a bath and ushering Violet upstairs to get cleaned up and changed. She paused long enough to show Asher to the parlor and bring him coffee, which he accepted gratefully. Thank you," Martha said quietly, settling into a chair across from him, "for bringing her home safe. We were so worried when the stage did not arrive on schedule, and with all the troubles on the roads lately, we feared the worst. The bandits took everything, Asher said. Money, valuables, the horses. They left her for dead. Martha's face crumpled. That poor child has been through so much already. Did she tell you about her family? Asher shook his head. Her parents died of cholera 2 years ago, Martha said softly. Violet was caring for them until the end. After they passed, she stayed on at the farm alone, trying to make it work, but it was too much for one person. She wrote to us a few months ago asking if she could come stay until she figured out her next step. Of course we said yes. She is George's niece, his only living family besides me. What happened to her tongue? Asher asked, the question that had been burning in him since he found her. Martha's expression darkened. That happened when she was 16. There was a man in Sacramento, a preacher, who came to town. Violet's father invited him to dinner, and the man became obsessed with her. When she rejected his advances, he claimed she was possessed by demons and needed to be purified. He gathered some followers, and they held her down and cut out her tongue, saying it spoke the devil's lies. Rage, hot and bright, flooded through Asher. His hands clenched around the coffee cup hard enough that he heard it crack. Martha noticed and reached out to gently touch his arm. The law did nothing, called it a religious matter. Violet's father wanted to kill the man, but he had already left town. They never found him. It broke her parents' hearts, what happened to their daughter. I think it contributed to their deaths, all that grief and rage with nowhere to go. Asher could not speak. He thought about Violet's smile by the firelight, the way she had applauded when he caught the fish, her determination to keep moving despite pain. That someone had done that to her, stolen her voice in the name of God or righteousness or whatever twisted logic they had used to justify it, made him want to break things. She is stronger than she knows, Martha continued, but she has been through a darkness that would have destroyed a lesser person. I hope you understand that she needs gentleness now. Patience. I understand, Asher said roughly. When Violet came downstairs an hour later, she was transformed. Clean, dressed in a simple blue dress that brought out the warmth in her skin, her dark hair braided and coiled at the nape of her neck. She looked younger somehow, and more fragile without the dirt and blood. But her eyes found Asher's immediately, and she smiled. Supper was awkward at first. George asked questions about the attack that made Violet flinch, and Martha had to shush him several times. Asher ate in silence, unused to table manners and formal meals, hyper-aware of every noise and movement. But gradually, the conversation found easier topics. Martha talked about the town, the neighbors, the new school teacher who had arrived last month. George discussed his work at the general store and the plans to expand. Violet wrote occasionally in her journal to add comments or answer questions, passing it around the table. When dessert came, apple pie still warm from the oven, she tapped Asher's arm and pointed to his plate with a questioning look. It is good, he said, and she smiled, pleased. After dinner, Martha insisted Asher stay the night. It is too late to head back to the mountains now, and you must be tired. We have a spare room. Asher wanted to refuse, but Violet's hand found his under the table, her fingers curling around his palm. It was the first time she had held his hand, and the contact sent warmth spreading through his chest. He looked at her and saw the plea in her eyes. All right, he heard himself say. One night. Martha beamed and began clearing dishes. George excused himself to do some bookkeeping. Violet tugged Asher's hand, pulling him toward the front porch, and he followed. Outside, the evening air was cool and sweet, scented with the jasmine that grew wild around the porch. Violet settled onto the porch swing and patted the space beside her. Asher sat, the swing creaking under his weight, and they rocked gently in silence for a moment. Then Violet pulled out her journal, the ever-present companion, and wrote by the light spilling from the windows. I do not want you to leave. Asher read the words and felt something twist in his chest. I have to go back eventually. My life is in the mountains. I know, but not yet. Please, you are the first person in 4 years who has looked at me like I am whole. He turned to look at her fully, seeing the vulnerability in her expression. You are whole, he said firmly. Missing a tongue does not make you less of a person. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears, and then she did something that surprised him. She took his hand and pressed it to her throat, holding it there. He could feel her pulse beneath his fingers, fast and strong. Then she moved his hand to her chest, over her heart. The same rhythm, steady and sure. "I am alive," she mouthed, and he could read the words on her lips. "Because of you." "You would have survived without me," Asher said, but his hand stayed where she had placed it, feeling the beat of her heart through the fabric of her dress. She shook her head and wrote one-handed, her other hand keeping his pressed to her chest. "Maybe, but I do not think I would have wanted to. You gave me hope again." They sat like that for a long time, his hand over her heart, the swing moving gently, the night settling around them. Asher could not remember the last time he had felt this kind of peace, this sense of connection. It terrified him. "I do not know how to do this," he said quietly. "I have been alone for so long. I do not know how to be around people anymore." Violet squeezed his hand, then let go long enough to write. "I do not know how to do this either, but maybe we can figure it out together." When Martha called them in for the evening, Asher felt a strange reluctance to move. The spare room was small but clean, with a real bed and quilts that smelled like lavender. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Somewhere above him, he knew Violet was lying awake too. He could feel the pull of her, like a compass pointing north. Morning came too soon and too bright. Martha made a huge breakfast, and Asher forced himself to eat, even though his stomach was in knots. He needed to leave, needed to get back to the safety and solitude of his mountain camp. But when he stood to go, Violet's hand found his arm. She wrote quickly, "Will you come back?" "I do not know," he said honestly. "Please try." He looked at her for a long moment, memorizing the curve of her face, the hope in her eyes. Then he nodded once and walked out the door before he could change his mind. The journey back to the mountains felt longer than it should have. Asher pushed hard, trying to outrun the unfamiliar ache in his chest. He told himself it was better this way, that Violet would be safe with her family, that she would forget about the mountain man who had carried her to safety. But when he reached his camp and settled in for the evening, the silence felt oppressive instead of peaceful. He lasted 3 days before he admitted defeat. On the 4th morning, he packed supplies and headed back to Winnetka, his heart pounding harder with each mile. When he arrived at the Emerson house, Violet was sitting on the front porch with a basket of mending. She looked up at the sound of his boots on the path, and her face transformed with joy. She dropped the basket and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist and pressing her face against his chest. Asher stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the contact, then slowly wrapped his arms around her shoulders. She was shaking, he realized, and making small sounds in her throat that might have been sobs or laughter. "I came back," he said unnecessarily. She pulled away enough to look up at him, tears streaming down her face, and nodded frantically. Then she grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the house, chattering at him in her wordless way, pointing and gesturing. Martha appeared in the doorway, a knowing smile on her face. "Well, well, I wondered how long you would last up there alone." Over the following weeks, Asher found himself spending more and more time in Winnetka. He would come down from the mountains every few days, bringing game or furs to trade, and would invariably end up at the Emerson house. Sometimes he and Violet would sit on the porch, communicating in their developing language of touches and gestures. Other times, they would walk through the oak groves outside town, and she would show him things she found interesting. A bird's nest, a oddly shaped rock, flowers blooming out of season. They developed new ways of understanding each other. Asher learned that when Violet touched her temple, she was thinking deeply about something. When she touched her lips, she was frustrated by her inability to speak. When she touched his face, gentle fingers against his bearded cheek, she was saying something tender that words could not capture anyway. For her part, Violet learned to read the subtle shifts in Asher's expression. The tightening around his eyes meant he was uncomfortable with the crowd or noise. The softening of his mouth meant he was amused, even if he did not smile. The way his shoulders relaxed when she touched him meant he felt safe with her. George and Martha watched this growing intimacy with approval. One evening, George pulled Asher aside while Violet was helping Martha with dishes. "I know what your intentions are with my niece," George said without preamble, "and I will tell you straight. She has been hurt enough. If you are not serious about her, if this is just a passing fancy, you need to walk away now." Asher met the older man's eyes steadily. I'm serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Good. Because that girl has a heart of gold, and she deserves someone who will cherish it. Can you do that? I can try, Asher said. I'm not good at this, but I will try. George clapped him on the shoulder. That is all any of us can do. It was Martha who suggested delicately that perhaps Asher and Violet should not spend quite so much time alone together. People talk, she said, and Violet's reputation has already been damaged by what happened to her. We do not want to give the gossips more ammunition. So Asher started coming to Sunday dinners, sitting stiffly in the parlor making conversation with George while Violet helped Martha in the kitchen. He attended the town's harvest festival, standing awkwardly on the edges while Violet laughed silently at the children's games. He even went to church once, though the sermon about righteous judgment made his jaw clench so hard he thought his teeth might crack. It was after that church service that things changed. They were walking back to the Emerson house, Violet's hand tucked into the crook of Asher's elbow, when a woman stopped them on the street. Violet Emerson, the woman said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, how nice to see you have found someone willing to overlook your affliction. Though I must say, a savage mountain man seems about right for someone like you. Violet flinched, her hand tightening on Asher's arm, but before he could respond, the woman continued. We all know what you did to deserve what happened to you, lying about a man of God, trying to seduce him with your wiles. It is a mercy you cannot spread more lies now. Rage exploded in Asher's chest, white-hot and consuming. He took a step toward the woman, and she actually stumbled backward at the look on his face. You have 5 seconds to walk away, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Before I forget, I am supposed to be civilized. The woman's face went pale. Are you threatening me? I'm promising you that if you ever speak to her like that again, you will regret it. Now get out of my sight. The woman fled, her skirts rustling, and Asher turned to find Violet staring at him with wide eyes. He expected fear, maybe anger at his loss of control. Instead, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him. It was the first time their lips had met, and Asher felt the world tilt on its axis. Her mouth was soft and warm against his, and she tasted like the honey cake Martha had served after church. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, forgetting they were standing in the middle of the street, forgetting everything except the feel of her in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Violet was crying again. But she was smiling too, pressing her forehead against his chest. I love you, Asher said, the words surprising him even as they left his mouth. I did not mean to, did not want to, but I do. Violet pulled back and cupped his face in her hands, making sure he was looking at her. Then she mouthed carefully, slowly, I love you too. He could read it on her lips, could see it in her eyes, could feel it in the way her hands trembled against his skin. And just like that, the last of his resistance crumbled. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church, with Martha crying happy tears and George beaming with pride. Violet wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Martha had made, and Asher wore new clothes that felt stiff and uncomfortable, but were appropriate for the occasion. The preacher kept the ceremony short, understanding that Violet could not speak her vows aloud. Instead, she had written them out beforehand, and George read them on her behalf. I, Violet Emerson, take you, Asher Pierce, to be my husband. I promise to love you through all seasons, to trust you with my heart, to build a life with you wherever that may be. You have shown me that I am not broken, only changed. You have given me hope when I thought I had none left. I will spend the rest of my life showing you the same grace. When it came time for Asher's vows, his voice was rough with emotion. I, Asher Pierce, take you, Violet Emerson, to be my wife. I promise to protect you, to listen to you in whatever way you need to be heard, to love you exactly as you are. You have brought light back into a life I thought was destined for darkness. I will spend every day trying to be worthy of that gift. They exchanged simple gold bands, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Asher kissed his bride with a tenderness that made Martha cry even harder. The question of where they would live was answered more easily than Asher had expected. Violet made it clear through her writing that she wanted to go to the mountains with him, wanted to leave the town and its whispers behind. Martha and George were hesitant at first, worried about her safety and comfort, but Violet was adamant. "I have lived my whole life trying to fit into a world that sees me as damaged," she wrote. "With Asher, I can just be myself. That is worth more than any comfort." So they spent the first weeks of their marriage preparing. Asher expanded his camp, building a proper cabin with George's help. It was small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace and real windows that George hauled up from town. They furnished it simply. A bed frame that Asher built himself, a table and chairs, shelves for Violet's growing collection of journals. Martha packed them supplies and taught Violet how to preserve food for the winter. She also pulled Asher aside one afternoon, her face serious. "She is strong, but she's been through trauma that will stay with her," Martha said. "There will be days when she is sad or afraid or angry at what was taken from her. You need to be patient with that." "I will be," Asher promised. When they finally moved to the cabin in late November, the first snow had already started to fall. Asher carried Violet over the threshold, making her laugh silently, and set her down in front of the fireplace where a fire was already crackling. She turned in a slow circle, taking in their new home, then turned to him with shining eyes and signed something he had learned meant home. That first winter in the mountains was a revelation for both of them. They developed new routines, new ways of being together. Asher taught Violet how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to set snares for rabbits, how to tell which plants were safe to eat. Violet taught him patience, showed him how to find joy in small things, reminded him every day that he was capable of gentleness. Their communication evolved into something almost instinctive. Violet would wake in the night sometimes, crying from nightmares, and Asher would pull her close without a word, his heartbeat against her back anchoring her to the present. Other times, Asher would come back from hunting with tension coiled in his shoulders, the old war memories pressing close, and Violet would take his hand and press it to her heart, reminding him that he was safe, that he was home. They made love by firelight and starlight, learning each other's bodies with reverence and patience. Violet taught him that communication went deeper than words, that her hands on his skin could say things a tongue never could. Asher showed her that she was beautiful, desirable, whole, worshiping every inch of her until she believed it. One evening in late January, Violet tapped his shoulder where he sat by the fire working on a new pair of snowshoes. When he looked up, she held out her journal with a nervous expression. "I think I might be pregnant," she had written. Asher felt his heart skip a beat. "Are you sure?" She nodded, one hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. He crossed the small cabin in 2 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her, his large hands covering hers. "How do you feel about it?" She smiled and guided his hand more firmly against her belly, then tapped twice on his wrist. "Happy." "Me too," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "God, Violet, me too." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. Violet bloomed with it, her face glowing, her body ripening. Asher became even more protective, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a cup. She would roll her eyes at his hovering, but he could tell she was secretly pleased by his attentiveness. They made plans. Asher reinforced the cabin, built a cradle from smooth pine, stockpiled supplies. Violet sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her stitches neat and careful. When her belly grew large enough that she could no longer reach the table comfortably, Asher moved their meals to a lower surface. When her back ached, he would massage it with warm oil until she fell asleep in his arms. In May, when the wildflowers were blooming across the mountain meadows, Martha and George made the trip up to check on them. Martha took one look at Violet's size and declared the baby would come within the month. "I should stay," Martha said. "You will need help when the time comes." But Violet shook her head and wrote firmly, "Asher will be here. That is all I need." When labor started on a warm June morning, Asher felt fear claw at his throat. He had faced down enemy soldiers, hostile wildlife, and the worst that nature could throw at him, but the sight of Violet in pain made him want to run. But she needed him, so he stayed. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool water, supported her when she needed to walk, held her steady when she needed to squat. Hours passed, the sun moving across the sky. Violet made sounds of pain that tore at his heart, but she never gave up, never stopped fighting. When the baby finally emerged in the late afternoon, slippery and screaming, Asher caught the tiny body in his large hands and stared in wonder. A boy. They had a son. He placed the baby on Violet's chest, watching as she examined their child with tears streaming down her face. The baby had dark hair like both of them, a loud voice, and tiny, perfect fingers that immediately wrapped around Violet's thumb. "He is beautiful," Asher said, his own voice thick. "You are amazing. God, Violet, you are so strong." She looked up at him with exhausted joy and mouthed, "Our son." They named him Thomas, after Violet's father. He was a healthy baby, loud and demanding, and he transformed their lives completely. Asher discovered reserves of tenderness he had not known he possessed, holding his son against his broad chest and singing old army songs in his rumbling voice. Violet nursed the baby and wrote in her journals about every small milestone, every change. Thomas learned his mother's language early. By the time he was 6 months old, he understood that when she tapped twice, she wanted him to look at her. When she touched her heart, she loved him. When she touched his nose gently, she was playing. As he grew, Thomas became the bridge between his parents and the wider world. He learned to speak from his father and from occasional visits to town, but he also learned his mother's silent language. By the time he was 3 years old, he could translate for her, turning her gestures and expressions into words that others could understand. They had 2 more children over the next 5 years, a daughter they named Sarah, who had her father's green eyes and her mother's stubborn spirit, and another son, James, who was quiet and thoughtful like Asher. The cabin grew with the family, Asher adding rooms as they needed them. George and Martha visited regularly, delighting in their great-nieces and great-nephew. Other families started building in the foothills too, drawn by the promise of land and freedom, and gradually a small community formed. Violet found herself with friends for the first time since losing her voice, other women who did not care that she could not speak, who learned to communicate with her through writing and gesture. She taught one neighbor how to preserve berries, another taught her how to make soap. They would gather for quilting bees and conversation, and Violet's laughter, silent but genuine, became a familiar sound. Asher never quite lost his preference for solitude, but he learned to tolerate the social occasions that mattered to his wife. He taught the local boys how to hunt and track. He helped other men build their cabins and barns. He became known as someone you could count on, strong and steady and true to his word. But his favorite times were still the quiet evenings when the children were asleep and he and Violet could sit together by the fire. She would lean against his shoulder, his arm around her waist, and they would communicate in their private language of touches and glances. Sometimes she would pull out her journal and write things she wanted to say properly, and he would read them and respond. Other times, they would sit in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the night sounds of the mountains soft beyond the walls. On their 10th anniversary, Asher gave Violet a gift he had been working on for months, a wooden box filled with carved animals. Each one represented something from their life together: a bear for strength, a deer for grace, a wolf for loyalty, an eagle for freedom. And at the center, 2 human figures intertwined, the man's hand over the woman's heart. Violet cried when she saw it, touching each carving with reverent fingers. Then she pulled out her journal and wrote, "You have given me everything I thought I lost: voice, family, hope, love. How can I ever thank you enough?" "You already have," Asher said, covering her hand with his. "Every single day you already have." Thomas grew into a tall, serious young man with his father's build and his mother's heart. He went to school in Winnetka during the winters, coming home on weekends, and worked the land with Asher during the summers. By the time he was 18, he was courting a girl from town, a schoolteacher's daughter who learned sign language so she could speak with his mother. Sarah was wild and free, more comfortable in the mountains than any town. She could shoot as well as her father by the time she was 12 and had no patience for the expectations placed on young women. Violet saw herself in her daughter and encouraged that independence, even when it worried Asher. James was the quiet one, always reading when he could get books, always asking questions about the world beyond the mountains. He wanted to be a doctor, he told them when he was 14, wanted to help people the way his father had helped his mother. The years passed like the seasons, each one bringing changes but also a sense of continuity. George passed away peacefully in his sleep when Violet was 35, and Martha followed 2 years later. They buried them in the Winnetka Cemetery, and Violet grieved the loss of the aunt and uncle who had given her a home when she needed one. But she had her own home now, her own family, a life built from nothing with a man who had learned to hear her when she could not speak. When Violet was 40, the children grown and building their own lives, she and Asher found themselves alone again for the first time in years. The cabin felt too big and too quiet without the chaos of family. One evening, Violet tapped Asher's arm and held out her journal. "Are you happy? Truly happy?" He looked at her, this woman who had changed everything, who had taught him that love was worth the risk of pain. Her hair had threads of silver now, and there were lines around her eyes from smiling. She was more beautiful to him than she had been at 20. "Yes," he said simply. "Every day with you is a gift I never expected to receive," she wrote again. "No regrets about the life you gave up, the solitude you loved." "I gave up nothing," he said firmly. "I traded one kind of life for a better one. You and the children, this family we built. It is more than I ever dreamed of having." Violet set down her journal and took his face in her hands, studying him as if memorizing every detail. Then she kissed him, slow and deep, and when she pulled back, she mouthed the words she had said 1,000 times in 1,000 ways over the years. "I love you. I love you too," he said. "Always." They had 20 more years together, watching their children have children of their own, watching the community around them grow and thrive. Asher taught his grandsons to hunt and fish. Violet taught her granddaughters to sow and preserve food. They told stories about the old days, about how they met, about the language they had created together. When Asher's joints started to ache with age and his hair turned fully white, Violet would massage his shoulders and back, her hands still sure and strong. When Violet had days where the old pain of what had been done to her resurfaced, Asher would hold her and remind her of all the joy she had brought into the world despite that cruelty. Asher died first, in his sleep at 78, his hand clasped in Violet's. She sat with his body for a long time, one hand over his heart, feeling for the beat that was no longer there, saying goodbye in the only way she knew how. The children wanted her to come live with one of them, but Violet refused. She stayed in the cabin they had built together, surrounded by memories and journals filled with their life. She lasted 2 more years before she followed him, dying quietly in the bed they had shared. Her hand pressed to her own heart, the way he had taught her, meant "I am here. I am alive. I am whole." They buried her next to Asher on the mountain they had loved, under the oak tree where they had sat so many evenings watching the sunset over the valley. Thomas carved a single stone for both of them, and on it he wrote the truth of their lives. She had no tongue to speak with. He learned her touch and understood every word she said. Together, they created a language of love that needed no voice. The grandchildren would visit the grave sometimes and tell stories about their grandparents, about how Asher had been the strongest, gentlest man in the territory, about how Violet had been kind and patient, teaching them that there were many ways to communicate, many ways to be heard. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right through the oak tree, the grandchildren swore they could feel it, a presence that felt like a large hand covering a smaller one, like 2 hearts beating in perfect rhythm, like a love that had transcended every obstacle and would last beyond death itself. The cabin stood for many years after, maintained by the family, a reminder that home is not a place, but rather the person whose touch you understand better than words, whose silence speaks louder than any voice, whose love becomes the very language of your heart. Asher and Violet had found that in each other against all odds, a mountain man and a woman with no tongue, building something beautiful from broken pieces, proving that the truest communication happens not through words, but through the touching of souls, the meeting of hearts, the perfect understanding that comes when 2 people choose each other completely, wholly, without reservation. Their story became legend in the growing community, passed down through generations as an example of what love could be when it was patient, when it was kind, when it learned to listen with more than just ears. Children grew up hearing about the mountain man who could read his wife's every gesture, who never once treated her silence as a lack, but as simply a different way of being in the world. And in the journals that Violet had kept so meticulously throughout their lives, which Thomas preserved and eventually donated to the California Historical Society, future generations would read about their love in her own words. The early entries, full of pain and desperation, gradually transforming into hope, into joy, into a deep, abiding contentment. The final entry, written just weeks before her death, said simply, "I thought I lost everything when they took my tongue. But I learned that words are not the only way to speak, and speaking is not the only way to be heard. Asher taught me that. He gave me a voice that was louder than any I could have had with a tongue. He gave me love that listened not to what I could not say, but to who I was beneath the silence. And in return, I gave him everything I had, everything I was, everything I would become. We built a language all our own, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything." Those who read her words would often cry, moved by the testament to love's ability to adapt, to overcome, to create new ways of connecting when the old ways were lost. They would think about their own relationships, their own communication, and wonder if they were truly listening, truly hearing, truly understanding the people they loved. The mountain where Asher and Violet had built their life remained largely unchanged as California grew and modernized around it. The cabin eventually became a museum, preserved by the family and protected by the state. Visitors would come to see how people lived in the 1870s, but they would leave thinking about how two people loved. Students studying the history of disability and communication would discover Violet's story and marvel at how she had created a full, rich life without spoken language in an era when most people with such disabilities were institutionalized or hidden away. Researchers studying trauma and resilience would read about her recovery, her ability to build joy from ashes and find hope for their own patients. But perhaps the most important legacy of Asher and Violet's love was not in the history books or museums, but in the family they created. Their descendants numbered in the hundreds by the time California celebrated its bicentennial. Doctors and teachers, artists and engineers, farmers and soldiers, each one carrying forward the lessons their great-great-grandparents had lived. That communication is more than words. That love requires listening with your whole heart. That strength comes in many forms, that the world's cruelty does not have to define your story. That finding someone who understands you, truly understands you, is worth everything. Thomas's granddaughter, named Violet in honor of her great-grandmother, became a speech therapist specializing in nonverbal communication. She developed programs based on the techniques her ancestors had used, helping countless families learn to communicate across barriers of injury or disability. When people asked where she got her inspiration, she would tell them about a mountain man and a woman with no tongue who had loved each other so completely that they invented their own language. Sarah's descendants became wilderness guides and conservationists, protecting the mountains where their family had first put down roots. They would take visitors to the old cabin, to the oak tree gravesite, and tell stories about their wild grandmother and the parents who had taught her that freedom came in many forms. James became a doctor as he had dreamed, and his children and grandchildren followed in his footsteps. They specialized in treating trauma, in helping people recover from the unthinkable, in believing that healing was always possible. They carried forward Asher's gentle strength and Violet's stubborn hope, proving that what we survive can make us better, not bitter, if we have love to light the way. And so the story that began with blood on a wagon seat and ended with two bodies buried beneath an oak tree became something bigger than just one couple's love. It became a testament to human resilience, to the power of connection, to the truth that we are not defined by what is taken from us, but by what we build with what remains. Asher Pierce and Violet Emerson had understood that from the beginning. He had been a man shattered by war, hiding in the mountains from a world that no longer made sense. She had been a woman mutilated by religious fanaticism, silenced but not defeated. Together, they had found in each other the missing pieces they had not even known they were seeking. He had learned her touch and understood every word she said, not because it was easy, but because she was worth the effort. She had learned his silences and healed the wounds he carried, not because she had to, but because he was worth saving. And together, they had proven that love, real love, the kind that lasts beyond death and echoes through generations, is not about perfect people finding each other. It is about broken people choosing each other, day after day, learning each other's languages, speaking each other's truths, building something new from the fragments of what was lost. It is about a hand pressed over a heart, a language created from necessity, a life built on trust and patience, and the absolute certainty that this person, this moment, this love, is worth everything. That was what Asher and Violet had given to each other and to all who came after them. Not just a story, but a roadmap. Not just a history, but a promise. That love can transcend any barrier if we are willing to learn new languages, to listen with more than our ears, to speak with more than our mouths, to understand that the deepest truths are often communicated in the spaces between words, in the touching of hands, in the beating of hearts that have learned to move in rhythm. And that, perhaps, is the greatest love story of all, not one of perfection, but one of persistence. Not one of ease, but one of effort. Not one that was written in the stars, but one that was carved into mountain stone by two people who refused to let the world's cruelty write their ending. They wrote their own ending instead, Asher and Violet, the mountain man and the woman with no tongue. They wrote it in touch and gesture, in journals and carvings, in children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carry forward their truth. They wrote it in a cabin that still stands, in an oak tree that still grows, in a love that time cannot diminish. They wrote it, and we remember. We remember that she had no tongue to speak with, that he learned her touch, that he understood every word she said, and that together they proved that love needs no voice to make itself heard. It only needs two hearts willing to listen,